Today I'd like to speak about a really important topic, how art can naturalize violence and how it can promote imperialism without even declaring that it's imperialistic. This is really interesting how Russian artists try to oppose Russian war against Ukraine, and nonetheless the thing that they show is very similar to what the Kremlin would issue. How so? Well, if I can bear your attention for a minute, I'd like to introduce several subtle tactics that Russian propaganda uses, as well as kind of liberal artists and speakers use them as well. So there is no big difference who speaks imperialism. Someone who declares to be pro-Putin or against Putin. This is kind of one team playing in the same direction, okay? There are certain ideas that scholars in humanities call the narrative. This is like a simplified idea, a plot that one tells without needing to argue that this is right or wrong. This is like a belief that is repeated all over again. And I'll give you 3 examples of such narratives that have lots of variations. The first narrative is that Belarus, Russia and Ukraine is one brotherly nation. The variations of this is someone saying, oh, you know, my grandfather, my mom, my father are from Ukraine, or Kiev is the capital of Russian cities, or Kiev must be the center of Russian-speaking culture, or that Kiev, Donetsk or Mariupol are Russian cities. This is the narrative that I call Rusplaining. It comes from the same idea of Westplaining or mansplaining, when someone takes the position of the other side, of different gender, different culture, and tells what the people need to do. And Russians really play this game often. They claim to be anything just to grasp the control and say this is how it should be done. And I'll give you a few examples so you understand it in flash. The other narrative is the way to erase agency from people, and it's used for colonization in Russia, but also for internal colonization, meaning against the people who live in Russia but are not white Russians. This is the idea of someone not being able to speak for themselves. The example would be Ukraine is an artificial creation by Bolsheviks in 1917. This is how Putin started the war against Ukraine. Or Ukraine is a puppet of the West. The variation would be that Kazakhstan denied and did not accept the idea that Donetsk and Luhansk people's republics are separate states, because the president of Kazakhstan said in front of Putin that if we were to declare every separatist region individual country, then we would have 800 countries instead of 190 countries. And this what pissed off a lot of Russian liberals. The third subtle narrative is that it's all about actually defending oneself, that any attack is actually a defense. The main narrative sounds like that the attack on Ukraine was a defensive war. Lukashenko also used this narrative to say that, oh yeah, you know, we knew from which part of the world Belarus had to be attacked, so we attacked first. Some variations are that Ukraine is a Nazi state, that there are lots of Nazis in Ukraine, so it had to be taken care of, or that Ukraine was expected to place NATO's nuclear missiles on its territory. This is actually a very unpredictable narrative, because it's really hard to connect defense and attack in one narrative. And I'll show you how actually Russian liberal artists do it really well with images, because it's easier to do with visual associations than with concepts and historical explanations. Okay? So these were subtle narratives that you can find in liberal and conservative speech in Russia. Let's look at the examples. The first example is a conservative author who claims to be Ukrainian-based. He worked for one of Ukrainian politicians, Yatsenyuk, with his politological campaign. They failed, luckily, but nonetheless, he kind of claims to have direct access to Ukrainian culture, so he has agency to speak about it. It's Timofey Sergeytsev, who published 2 months ago the idea that anybody who doesn't speak Russian and does not support the agglomeration of Ukraine into Russia must be eliminated. This is a fascist idea, you know, there is no way you can argue against this, and this is a conservative narrative that Ukraine has no agency as such, and you know, and he explains this idea that, you know, it makes sense from the position of a Ukrainian not to want to be Ukrainian. And you also see this narrative that it's a defensive war against NATO, and I think that this is like an epitomic example of how conservatives use these narratives to argue for the war against Ukraine. But now let's look at the liberals, so-called liberals, and the first one is Latynina. Yulia Latynina used to be very popular on the Echo of Moscow, a state resource that was created by the Soviet Union in the 60s to show the diversity of its political opinion. It can sound funny, but I suspect that actually there was a new agenda by the head of the KGB, Yuri Andropov, who tried to show that the Soviet Union is not monolithic as it was during Stalinism, so he kind of introduced alternative views, but they were, of course, curated, and they showed exactly the point of view that had to be shown. And so Yulia Latynina is like this agent of influence who pretends to be liberal, but at the same time she says exactly the same thing as Putin. And since the war started and the Echo of Moscow was closed because it criticized the corruption in the army, not the invasion itself, but the corruption, the only place that she could use to express her opinion is public media, where she asks questions like, oh yeah, if Mariupol is a Russian city, why you're bombing this? But the idea is to claim that Mariupol is a Russian city. She also publishes similar things on her Twitter, and because of the backfire that it causes, she started deleting her tweets. So the only way to have them is to print screen them, and luckily I have some print screens for the future. And we can find lots of examples where she claims that, look, Ukrainian language is the language of uneducated people, or she contradicts herself saying that, look, the Ukrainian language is the language of intelligentsia and regular people don't speak it. So the whole point is to divide the society and say that, you know, Ukrainian culture, Ukrainian literature, Ukrainian language are misplaced in Ukraine itself. Ukraine is just the territory that Russia has to control, and you know, then she says that the same about Kazakhstan and so forth. But you know, she worked in the media. That's her job. She makes money out of it, and obviously, you know, the places that represented her have dubious reputation. Maybe it can fool some people in Russia with this label of being liberal, but there are also there are some people who are perceived as dissident in the West because they don't know their background. One of them would be Mikhail Khodorkovsky, who was jailed by Putin, so he has personal beef with the president. And at the same time, when you listen to him, he again voices very imperialistic message about Ukraine, that, you know, I will not use the proper pronoun. You know, Ukraine is still a territory to me, and nobody will teach me how to speak about Ukraine in the Russian language. And also, he just lied a month ago that the Russian army is not bombing civil population. Well, it's not true, obviously. But the whole point is just, you know, to spread misinformation, pretending to be the opposition leader. And I guess that this is very pragmatic for him, because he still wants to get the votes and support from the people who support Putin, but just in a way that he criticizes the way Putin does things. And lots of people pointed out that people like Latynina and Khodorkovsky actually just argue against the type of politics that the Kremlin leads now, that soft politics would be better to colonize Belarus and Ukraine, and they directly say this. And there's some smarter politicians who build their double, triple identity to claim that they're speaking from the position of alternative. For instance, Maxim Katz, he's very good at polarizing Ukrainian society, and he also pretends to be a Jewish voice. He puts Hebrew in his videos. He says that he speaks the language and that he's half Jewish. But when it comes to speaking about Ukraine, he voices absolutely like white Russian narratives about it. And probably if at some point he had to speak about Jews in Russia, he would stand on the position of a Russian imperialist, saying that, you know, they don't have their separate identity, should be incorporated in Russian imperialism and so forth. So this is a way actually to Russ-plain other perspectives, just claiming to be someone else. And Maxim Katz is doing this, and when he speaks about the Russian special operation in Ukraine, he changes his position all the time to fit the leading narrative, but his initial attempts to kind of think about the situation was to say that Russian army is not successful again because of corruption and because of its sinister goals. And he has literally the video where he discusses why the Russian army fails, while, you know, actually from the Ukrainian perspective it sounds really sinister to carry about why it fails. You know, I would rather carry why it even like does what it does, like, you know, why the morale is so low. Okay. The only thing that I want to say here in defense of liberal voices on the Russian territory, in Tatarstan, Buryatia and other places, is that there is negative selection of who represents this voice. People like Andrei Sakharov, Anna Politkovskaya, Boris Nemtsov were against wars. Sakharov was against the Afghan war, Politkovskaya was against the genocide of Chechens in the Second Chechen War, Boris Nemtsov was against the war against Ukraine in 2014. You know, check their biographies. Sakharov was in jail for 6 years in a secret city, Politkovskaya was killed for Putin's birthday, Boris Nemtsov was killed 200 meters from the Kremlin. So this is how the real liberal voice is suppressed, and people who pretend to be liberals are actually most likely paid trolls. And you know, if you expect that Alexei Navalny is any different, then you probably haven't followed him for a while, and you have a really superficial vision of him. I'll make a separate video about him. So, sorry for my long introduction, but I think that this is really important, that art does not invent anything new, and it also doesn't stand outside of politics. It's just a reflection of politics, and sometimes it's conscious, but more often it's just inertia, because the artists are not able to think on their own. They just want to give what the people already expect from them. Even being critical against Putin, they still want to get support from the people, and if they want blood, violence, they give it to the audience. And there's a big problem with this, because violence is fetishized in Russian art. There are two examples of people who are definitely against the war, like Haski, a rapper from Ulan-Ude, who definitely showed an ugly face of Russia, internal colonization of Buryatia. He responds to this with a song where he mentions that I need a bullet for a Jew, a Ukrainian, and also for a Russian. And this way he kind of destroys the idea of directed violence, but also he shows that without violence there is no possibility of social development in the country. The other artist, who is probably one of the most progressive ones, from Ufa. It's a city in Tatarstan. directly claims that Crimea is not Russia and that Russia is stealing from other countries, but the tone of this declaration is definitely suicidal. So it seems like the most liberal approach to violence in Russia is to commit suicide, and I hear it often in songs like "Kill Me" or "I'll be killed," "It's fine to die." From the perspective of an outsider from this culture, these are self-defeating narratives, and there something should be done about this. But there is also natural violence, or naturalization of violence, when it can be taken out of the context. It's the part that's the matrix, the fabric of reality. And I would say that I Speak, which is a very poetic way to call the band, because it's like I speak, but also it's the peak of a mountain and it's cold. It represents the lyrics and the metaphorical essence of this band. We can see what they do with violence. They mix it with alternative images when we cannot separate the image of violence, which is the police who hits the dead people already with a stick, and also the opposite, like love and the LGBT, because it's definitely not just love, it's just homosexual love. You know, women kiss women, men kiss men, but also the image of life and death. These all merge together in a mosh pit, you know, heavy music dance, where we don't see the difference, and we see this mixture in, you know, in books like Pilevin's, in Snuff, the book of 2011, when we cannot separate what is Ukraine, that represents zombies, and what is Byzantine, which represents probably the West, or maybe it's reversed, and actually Russia is Ukraine and Ukraine is Byzantine. So, you know, we just cannot locate the meaning, but we know it's there. It just, our eyes are blind to the signifier. So violence becomes irreducible, but at the same time there is a certain opposition to it which we need to look for. But these are, you know, very subtle ways of contradicting the violent reality. While I wanted to talk about two examples of art that only claims to be liberal, as Latynina, Khodorkovsky, or Maxim Katz, while actually at the same time being very, very imperialistic. So the first example polarized a lot of Ukrainians, and the leading party in Ukraine, the party of Zelensky, published it on their Facebook, probably showing Russian support of the Ukrainian cause by an international artist who lives now in Brooklyn. But what we see in his video is absolutely imperialistic. First of all, I should say the tone of the whole video can confuse anybody. It's very ecstatic. We see, well, actually white people with Orthodox crosses on their chest, lots of crosses. They sit in hay in a village. It all looks like it's Second World War. It's very different to actually what you would encounter in Ukraine right now. The lyrics hint to the Third Reich and Berlin for some reason. Ukraine starts with the Dnieper River, while first, you know, it's actually confusing because Ukraine starts with Don, which is 400 kilometers to east. Lots of things, but also you know, the ecstatic face that I see on his on the Max Pokrovsky's you know, expression is really weird, because it shows, like, you know, that he's paralyzed by his emotions. He cannot just speak straight, and it's very exaggerated. But when we think about the narratives that are implied here, first of all, it's Rusplaining. In the chorus, he sings, "Oh, Ukraine, my second part, from Dnipro to Berlin." And I asked myself, okay, why his second part? He's a Russian, he speaks Russian, he has no connection to Ukraine. And then, there is a backstory that his mother is a Ukrainian. It doesn't make sense to me because it would mean that if he has the DNA of a Ukrainian, it immediately makes him a Ukrainian, which is not true. I'll give you like a really weird comparison, but it's exactly the same. Like if you have Mongolian DNA but you live in Russia, you speak Russian, you know nothing about Mongolian culture, are you a Mongolian? Well, technically, yes, maybe for the Russian nationalist, and they think that you are spoiling their blood. This narrative that my DNA defines who I am can work against any inclusion, because that would mean that anybody who is not ethnically Russian cannot be a Russian subject. I disagree with this completely. So he's Rus-plaining because he says that he's Ukrainian just because there is some family connection to Ukraine. No way. The second thing is that he raises Ukrainian agency by reproducing the same idea, the same image of Ukraine as a territory, as a village. First of all, most of the events happened in the cities. Russia shells Ukrainian schools, institutions. There is nothing to shell in villages, most of them. So, and the third thing is the implication of the Second World War, the idea that, again, Berlin, Third Reich, how is it connected? Actually, Germany is one of the biggest sponsors of Russia in this war, because they just bought oil for 6 billion euros, and until the last moment, the Chancellor of Germany and also the President of France were on the side of this kind of, in-betweenness, that we need to find a way for dialogue with a dictator who just says that he wants to colonize a sovereign nation. With all this, there was certain polemics about what's happening here, and I think that we need to move on with a second example, which just got published, and again, it was confusing for many people what's happening in this video, and I promise you that this is much easier to deconstruct. It's Little Big, the band that is known in Europe, popular among teenagers, and it also uses the narratives that are connected to internal colonization in Russia. The main narrative is the erasure of agency. It's important to say for a Russian subject that we have no choice. There are just big politicians, that's their play. We should not go out to streets, we can do nothing about it. And what happened in Ukraine with Maidan, the revolution of dignity, a revolution against Yanukovych, these are all Western staged events, and it's impossible to do anything about Putin. We're just doing what we're told because there is no way out of it. And it's very ridiculous of how Little Big reproduces this in all ways, and some Russians, they think that this art is anti-imperialistic, while there is openly a scene when like a politician from America, probably, it's hard to decide immediately, but this politician gives a hot dog, which is probably an American image, to a guy who has blue and yellow, so Ukrainian flag, clothing. So these are like very subtle images of American imperialism driving the war in Ukraine. We see all these politicians who kind of could be probably Russian, but it's all associated actually with America, because we see the White House, we see the cigar, and the Manhattan Project-like case where they have the button to launch a nuclear missile, and the narrative is that this war will return us to the Stone Age, and it seems a very universal narrative. Yeah, war is bad. What about other countries, Afghanistan, you know, and so forth? What Russians love to say about their imperialist wars, that they're not the first one to do it. And, you know, if you really want to understand what's happening in this video, you have to be educated on this. You need to understand that this is the image of Ukraine, the image of the White House, the American politician, and it can be always twisted, right? Because this is your interpretation. You see what you see. But there is also this huge narrative that kind of equates Russia with the US, taking out of this equation exactly this war that Russia leads in Ukraine that has no justification, besides, of course, there are subtle narratives that it's just a defensive war against NATO and the US and whatever. So this is like, if you think that there is no difference, that this is one war of many, that the only way to defeat a cruel war is to defeat any war, then you buy into it. It doesn't matter who you support, you start supporting Russia because you let it do what it wants to do. And you know, this is like a side note after what I said, and you know, you probably want to leave a comment or share and subscribe this. I wanted to say one thing. Russia and all of these paid trolls from Pakistan, Ghana, and other countries where people don't really care about Europe, that they imply whataboutism as the last resort for their shitty comments. And they say, what about Afghanistan? Let's not forget that Russia and the Soviet Union were in war with the US in Afghanistan. So that was a Russian war that they still continue to fight, but informationally. Maybe they will continue to fight against the USA in Afghanistan because they pay Taliban openly. That's just like the news that they pay Taliban in Kyrgyzstan, so Taliban will not take the power over the government there. What about Syria? Again, Russia was a supporter of Assad, who used chemical weapons against rebellion. You know, and other countries, North Korea, Vietnam. Vietnam was also the USSR versus the US. This is a long-lasting conflict that Russia decided to revoke to get some profit out of it. And if you think about this, decide on this, whether it's possible to stop a war if there is a player like the USSR or Russia. Probably not. And the people who now sell their time for 10 cents in Pakistan and Africa, they don't understand that the war is global. And they are the part of this war, and they will also be the victims, but just a bit later, because Russia will do something in their countries as well. Thank you for your time, and let's not watch terrible art with violence. Thank you for your attention.